The blood pooling on the sterile tiles of Metropolitan Central's West Wing didn't belong to a patient, and the woman standing over the body, holding a trauma scalpel with the steady hand of an executioner and the cold, unblinking eyes of a seasoned killer, certainly wasn't a doctor. For 3 years, the staff at Metropolitan Central thought Naomi Vance was just the quiet, reliable night nurse who changed IV bags and apologized for being in the way. They saw a woman who was timid, a woman who was invisible, a woman who was weak. They were wrong. When Jax Hollis and his crew of hired guns locked down the trauma ward, he thought he was the apex predator entering a slaughterhouse. He didn't know he had just barricaded himself in a concrete box with the only person the Dragon of Soul answers to. This is the story of the night the gunman realized that the most dangerous place in the world isn't a back alley in Busan. It's the night shift of a woman who has nothing left to lose. It was a sweltering Tuesday in July when the humid city air finally broke into a violent thunderstorm, hammering against the reinforced glass of Metropolitan Central Hospital. On the 4th floor, the air was a thick cocktail of ozone, industrial bleach, and the low hum of life support machines. These were the ghost hours, the graveyard shift where the line between life and death becomes a blur. Naomi Vance sat at the nurse's station, the cool blue light of the vitals monitor reflecting in her dark, calculating eyes. To the casual observer, Naomi was a non-entity. She was 36, her scrubs slightly oversized, her hair pulled back into a functional, severe bun that made her look older than she was. She walked with a soft, practiced shuffle, rounding her shoulders as if trying to disappear into the very walls of the hospital. She never raised her voice. She never challenged the residents. "She's a total NPC, I swear," whispered a young nurse, leaning against the medication cart and scrolling through her phone. "I asked her if she had any plans for her anniversary, and she said meal prep. Can you imagine being married to someone that boring?" Dr. Aris, the senior trauma lead, didn't even look up from his clipboard. He was brilliant, exhausted, and far too arrogant to notice the people beneath him. "As long as she preps the trays on time, I don't care if she's a robot. Just keep her away from the VIP in room 412. She doesn't have the personality to handle high-profile families."
Eris was focused on his charts. He didn't notice that while Naomi appeared to be staring at a screen, she was actually timing the patrol of the security guard downstairs. He didn't notice that when a lightning strike shook the building, Naomi didn't flinch. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, her hand instinctively hovering near the concealed duffel bag tucked under the desk. He didn't notice the jagged, faded scar tissue on the back of her neck, hidden by her collar, a mark of loyalty to the Kang Syndicate. Naomi typed her notes. Patient in 410 stable. Vitals normal. IV replaced. She wasn't bored. She was a sentry, and the wolves were finally at the door. Please stay with us and subscribe to this channel as we unveil the story. The storm intensified, the wind howling through the concrete canyons of the city like a wounded beast. But inside Metropolitan Central, the silence was surgical. Naomi moved through the dim corridors of the West Wing, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the linoleum. To the rest of the staff, she was a shadow in blue scrubs, a woman so unremarkable she was practically part of the furniture. But beneath the loose fabric of her uniform, Naomi's skin hummed with a different frequency. In her pocket, a burner phone vibrated once. It was a short, sharp pulse, a signal from the world she had tried to leave behind. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. She knew that June Suck's business was escalating. The logistics her husband handled were reaching a boiling point, and the hospital's VIP patient in room 412 was the fuse. "Vance, stop daydreaming and get the charts for the new admission," Dr. Arris barked, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. He didn't wait for an answer, nor did he look at her face. To him, she was just a tool, a pair of hands to carry out his orders. Naomi paused, her eyes tracking a flicker of movement near the service elevators. She didn't turn her head, she used the reflection in the glass of a medicine cabinet. Two men in dark jackets had just stepped off, their gait heavy and purposeful, not the walk of worried relatives, but the measured stride of men carrying weight. "Right away, doctor," Naomi whispered, her voice a perfect mask of submission. She hunched her shoulders, shrinking into the persona of the timid nurse, yet her mind was already deconstructing the threat. Two targets, concealed items under their jackets, high-tension posture. She walked past the young intern, who was still complaining about the lack of excitement on the night shift. He had no idea that the woman he called boring was currently calculating the most efficient way to seal the wing. Naomi stepped into the medication room, closing the door behind her. For a fleeting second, the shuffling nurse vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin dropped, and her eyes turned as cold as the Siberian winter. She reached into the bottom of her locker, moving aside a stack of medical journals to reveal a small, nondescript duffel bag. She didn't open it yet. She simply felt the weight of it. For years, she had tried to balance the scales, saving lives here to make up for the shadows cast by June Suck's empire. But as the distant sound of a heavy door being kicked open shattered the ward's silence, Naomi realized the time for healing was over. The ghost in blue was about to become the ward's only hope, and the gunmen downstairs were about to learn that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should fear the most.
The silence of the West Wing didn't break. It shattered. It began with the sharp, rhythmic clack-slide of a bolt carrier group being sent home, a sound that didn't belong in a house of healing. Then came the roar. The double doors at the end of the corridor burst open as Jax Hollis stormed in, a dark silhouette framed by the flickering fluorescent lights. He wasn't a desperate man. He was a precision instrument of rage, his assault rifle leveled with terrifying intent. "Nobody move! Hands where I can see them!" Jax's voice boomed like a thunderclap, instantly turning the sterile ward into a tomb. Dr. Arris froze, his clipboard clattering to the floor as his face drained of all color. The young intern let out a stifled sob, his phone slipping from his trembling fingers. To the gunman, the staff looked like a collection of easy targets, sheep waiting for the blade. They didn't notice the nurse standing by the medication cart.
Naomi didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. In that heartbeat, the timid Nurse Vance receded, and the woman who had survived the inner circles of the Kang Syndicate stepped forward. Her heart rate didn't spike, it stabilized. Time slowed into a series of tactical frames. Target, male, heavy build, body armor visible beneath the jacket. Weapon, specialized platform, high-capacity magazine. Secondary threat, two men flanking the elevators. Naomi shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, her hands hovering near her center line. She wasn't looking at Jax's face. She was watching the safety on his rifle. It was off. Her mind, trained by years of logistics and survival, mapped the room in seconds, using the heavy steel medcard as cover, the trauma shears in her pocket as a primary deterrent. The wolves had entered the fold, but they had no idea that the woman in blue scrubs was the most dangerous predator in the building. Jax Hollis swung the muzzle of his rifle toward the nurse's station, his eyes manic as he scanned for any sign of resistance.
He saw a doctor paralyzed by fear and an intern on the verge of collapse, but his gaze stopped on Naomi. She didn't give him a reason to fire. Instead, she executed a perfect tactical deception. She let her knees tremble, her shoulders hunching forward until she looked fragile and broken. She let out a soft, staggered gasp, her hands flying up to her face in a display of absolute vulnerability. "Please," she whimpered, her voice cracking with a manufactured terror that reached her very fingertips. "I'm just a nurse. Don't hurt us." Jack sneered, the sight of her weakness feeding his ego. He saw a weakest link, a submissive target he could use to control the room. He beckoned her forward with a jerk of his weapon. "You, move. Get over here before I lose my patience." Naomi stumbled toward him, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. She tripped slightly, a calculated stumble that allowed her to drop her eyeline and scan his belt. In that split second of feigned clumsiness, her mind worked like a high-speed camera. She noted the brand of his sidearm, the placement of his spare magazines, and the small black detonator clipped to his vest. She smelled the faint scent of accelerant on his sleeves. She reached his side, clasping her hands to her chest in a prayer-like gesture of submission. She was now less than 3 feet away. Jack saw a terrified woman clinging to life. Naomi saw a target with a vulnerable neck, a poorly secured primary weapon, and a trigger finger that was beginning to sweat. The deception was complete. The trap was set. Jax Hollis made the fatal mistake of looking away, his head jerking toward the elevator as a chime echoed through the ward. In that quarter second of distraction, Naomi's fear evaporated. The timid nurse vanished, replaced by a strike team of 1. She didn't retreat, she exploded forward. Her left hand lashed out with the precision of a cobra, gripping the handguard of the rifle and shoving the muzzle toward the acoustic ceiling tiles. Before Jax could register the shift in power, Naomi's right hand whipped the heavy-duty trauma shears from her scrub pocket. She didn't use them to cut, she used them as a mechanical wedge, jamming the steel blades deep into the ejection port of the assault rifle with a sickening screech of metal on metal. The bolt carrier slammed forward, catching on the hardened steel of the shears. The weapon was dead. Jax roared, but the sound was cut short. Naomi transitioned her momentum, driving her palm into his chin and snapping his head back. As he stumbled, she didn't stop. She spun, using Jax as a human shield just as his backup reached for their sidearms. With a fluid, low-profile kick, she sent a heavy oxygen tank cart rolling into the shins of the second gunman. As he went down, Naomi reached into the supply tray on the nearby crash cart, grabbing a glass vial of a fast-acting sedative. In one blurred motion, she vaulted over the desk, neutralizing the third threat before he could even clear his holster. The ward was silent again, save for the heavy breathing of the terrified staff. The gunmen were down, but as Naomi looked at the blinking red light on the device Jax had dropped, she realized the nightmare was only beginning. The silence following the struggle was replaced by a rhythmic, predatory beep. Naomi's eyes locked onto the black device Jax had dropped, a brick of C4 wired to a crude receiver, its light blinking like a dying heart. Her gaze followed the secondary wires snaking under the door of the oxygen storage room. If the heat from the small fire Jax had ignited in the trash chute reached that room, the concentrated oxygen would turn the ward into a crater. "The building is breathing fire," Naomi stated, her voice now a chilling, level command that snapped Dr. Eris out of his stupor. "We have 6 minutes! Move!" She didn't wait for them to agree. Naomi grabbed a stack of heavy-duty bedsheets and soaked them under a nearby faucet. The smoke was already banking down from the ceiling, thick and oily. She realized the elevators were disabled, and the stairwell was a chimney of heat.
She turned to Mr. Henderson, a 250-pound patient post-surgery, and threw a wet sheet onto the floor. "On the sheet, now," she ordered. It was the life sled, a technique used for mass evacuation when equipment failed. By placing patients on the low-friction sheets against the wet linoleum, a single person could move double their weight with half the effort. Working with mechanical efficiency, Naomi harnessed her strength, linking the sheets together to form a human train. She ignored the searing heat against her skin and the frantic alarms. She was no longer just a nurse. She was the logistics officer of a battlefield evacuation, dragging the first 3 patients toward the only exit that remained, the reinforced windows of the far lounge. The smoke was no longer a mist. It was a descending wall of black silk that choked the air and blurred the emergency lights. Dr. Eris stood frozen, his brilliant mind locked in a loop of panic as he stared at the red digits on the explosive device. He was a man used to being the god of the operating theater, but in the face of raw chaos, his authority had vanished. "Doctor, look at me," Naomi commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a razor-edged clarity that sliced through the roar of the fire. Eris turned, blinking through the stinging haze. He saw a woman who had spent years in the shadows of a Mafia empire, a woman who understood the architecture of a crisis. "You and the intern are the motors," Naomi said, her eyes fixed on his. "Grab the intravenous poles to use as leverage. Secure the patients to the sleds. If someone stops moving, you don't look back. You pull." I don't take orders from," Eris began, his old arrogance flickering for a desperate second. Naomi stepped into his space, the heat of the approaching fire reflecting in her dark pupils. "In this room, I am the master key. I know exactly how much time we have before that oxygen manifold ruptures. You can lead these people to the exit, or you can stay here and be a memory. Choose. Now." The doctor looked at her hands, steady, scarred, and powerful, and finally saw the person he had ignored for 3 years. He nodded, his ego collapsing under the weight of her resolve. Under Naomi's direction, the staff became a cohesive unit. She moved through the ward like a conductor, turning terror into motion, forcing the elite surgeons to become the muscle for her master plan. They weren't just a hospital staff anymore. They were a squad, and Naomi was their commander. The lounge window was the final barrier between life and the abyss. Behind Naomi, the ward had become an orange furnace, the air screaming as the fire reached the oxygen room. Most of the patients had been lowered or aided by the first responders on the ladder below, but the path had collapsed. Naomi stood on the ledge, clutching 7-year-old Leo to her chest. The boy was shaking, his face buried in the blue fabric of her scrubs. "Don't look back, Leo," Naomi whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the center of the storm. "Just hold on to me. We're going to fly." A deafening thud shook the floor. The first of the oxygen tanks had ruptured. The C4 was seconds from its final count. Below, the fire department's ladder bucket swayed in the violent wind, still 10 feet out and 5 feet down. It was a gap that required more than strength. It required the absolute calculation of a woman who had lived her life on the edge. Naomi didn't hesitate. As the wall behind her vanished in a blooming crown of white-hot flame, she launched herself into the void. For a heartbeat, they were weightless, suspended against the backdrop of a shattering hospital wing. The glass exploded outward in a million glittering diamonds just as the C4 detonated, the shock wave acting as a terrifying propellant. Her boots slammed into the metal rim of the bucket with a bone-jarring impact. Her ribs screamed as she twisted her body to ensure Leo landed on top of her, cushioned by her own frame. The firefighter caught them, pulling them deep into the safety of the basket, just as a tongue of fire licked the space they had occupied. Naomi lay there, gasping in the rain, the invisible nurse who had just cheated death and saved a legacy. The rain washed the soot from Naomi's face as the ladder bucket touched the shimmering black asphalt. She stepped out, her movements stiff but purposeful, her eyes scanning the perimeter with a coldness that startled the surrounding paramedics. The emergency lights cast a strobe of red and blue over the scene, but another fleet of vehicles was already approaching, silent, black SUVs that didn't belong to the city's fleet. A dozen men in tailored overcoats stepped out of the cars, their presence instantly parting the crowd like a blade through silk. They moved with a clinical, terrifying discipline, ignored the police lines, and headed straight for the survivors' tent. At their center walked Kang Jun-suk. He was impeccably dressed despite the storm, his eyes like polished flint, searching for the one person who mattered. He stopped 10 feet away. His gaze swept over Naomi's torn, blood-stained scrubs, the trauma shears still gripped in her hand, and the neutralized threat being wheeled out on a gurney behind her. He saw Jax Hollis, disarmed and broken, and the remains of the ward his wife had single-handedly cleared.
One of Jun-suk's lieutenants moved to step toward the building, ready to handle the remains of the opposition. But the Mafia boss raised a single gloved hand. He didn't look at his men. He looked only at Naomi. He saw the fire still burning in her eyes, a reflection of his own power. "The ward is clear," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the rain with the authority of a general. "The threat is neutralized. There is nothing left for you to clean up, Jun-suk." The boss stood in silence, a rare, faint shadow of a smile touching his lips. He didn't offer a hand or a word of pity. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, peerless respect. His wife wasn't just a part of his world anymore. She was the architect of her own. 3 weeks later, the lobby of Metropolitan Central was a forest of microphones and television cameras. The mayor stood at the podium, a gold medal for bravery resting in a velvet box, waiting for the hero of the West Wing to step into the light. But the podium remained empty. Naomi Vance had no interest in the city's gratitude or a fleeting moment of fame. She was exactly where she belonged, 4 floors up in a ward that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The atmosphere on the floor had changed. The hushed, dismissive whispers were gone, replaced by a profound, watchful silence whenever Naomi entered a room. Dr. Aris was no longer barking orders. He stood at the nurse's station, waiting for her to finish her review of the morning charts. When she finally looked up, he didn't see an invisible assistant. He saw a leader. "The board approved the recommendation," Aris said, his voice quiet and genuinely respectful. He handed her a small, plastic-wrapped box. "It's not a medal from the mayor, but I think it's the only title you've ever cared about." Naomi opened the box. Inside was a new name badge. It didn't just say Naomi Vance, RN. In bold, clear letters, it read Naomi Vance, Charge Nurse. "That means more paperwork, Naomi," the young intern joked, though he was no longer looking at his phone. He was standing straight, waiting for his assignment. "It means the ward is mine," Naomi replied, her voice steady and commanding. She clipped the badge to her scrubs, the blue fabric as crisp as a uniform. Through the window, she saw a single black SUV pull away from the curb, a silent acknowledgement from her husband. The war was over, but the mission continued. Naomi turned back to her team, her eyes sharp and focused. "Show's over. We have patients to care for. Let's get to work." Thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe to our channel and rate this story in the comments section.